Good evening and welcome. I'm Liz Kirkwood, Executive Director of Flow. Tonight, I am delighted to welcome and present Great Lakes for Sale, an exclusive conversation with author Dave Dempsey and his newly updated book, joined by conversation host and fellow author Sally Cole-Misch. We're in for a very special treat. Before we dive into tonight's program, I'd like to offer some brief introductory remarks on Flow and this very special event, which of course includes Dave and Sally's featured conversation, readings, book giveaways, and question and answer session with those of you here in attendance. You can of course use the Q&A button found near the bottom center of your screen at any time to submit your questions, and we'll be using the chat box to share links. Please note, we are video recording this 1-hour session, and we will follow up by email to each of you with links to the recording and other resources. I'd like to begin with our water and land acknowledgement. Flow is located on lands historically occupied by the Three Fires Confederacy, the Anishinaabe, Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. We are grateful to these sovereign nations for sustaining their sacred waters since time immemorial, and are humbled to be a partner in protecting the Great Lakes watershed for future generations. We invite all to honor the first guardians of the water we love by incorporating the Anishinaabeg's water ethic and traditional ecological knowledge into our individual and collective relationships with water. I'd like to dedicate tonight's evening to a very dear friend of Flow and water warrior, Terry Swear, who we sadly lost this past week. Terry and her colleagues at Michigan Citizens for Water Conservation engaged in a David and Goliath struggle to challenge a multinational corporation's right to withdraw and bottle water in Mecosta County. With tenacious organizing skills, Terry led efforts to enlist some 1,800 members of the community in a formidable grassroots campaign and raised $400,000 for the effort, largely through community-based techniques such as bake sales, yard sales, and car washes. Through her years of service, Terry helped reshape the water rights debate in our state to better reflect the public's interest in Michigan's most important natural resource. Thanks to Terry and so many others, and our founder, Jim Olson, we at Flow are celebrating 10 years this year, a decade of partnering with you to keep our water public and protected. Our mission is to ensure that the waters of the Great Lakes Basin are healthy, public, and protected for all. Our work provides pathways and policy solutions for all people in the Great Lakes, residents, communities, businesses, tribes, and officials to assert our rights and responsibilities in relationship to the water. The author conversation we're about to experience tonight is the latest in a series of Flow presentations we call Art Meets Water. This initiative is an ongoing series of collaborations with committed artists inspired by the ability of art to amplify our critical connection to water. Many have been introduced to Flow's work through an artist's unique ability to combine our deepest loves and greatest fears with hope that comes from both individual and collective action. We in the Great Lakes Basin are water people. The lakes and rivers and groundwater inspire artists of every background. The water is what brings us together. Water inspires art, and that art in the form of poetry, music, paintings, dance, letters, drives us to protect the Great Lakes. As Jacques Cousteau reminds us, the life cycle and water cycle are one. Now, for the moment we've all been waiting for, please help me welcome Dave Dempsey and Sally Cole-Misch. It is my pleasure to introduce Dave, and I know he'll be coming on in a moment, who is our Senior Policy Advisor at Flow, a dear friend and one of the deepest thinkers I know on Great Lakes history and policy. Dave has nearly 40 years experience in environmental policy. He served as environmental advisor to former Michigan Governor James Blanchard, and as policy advisor of on the staff of the International Joint Commission. He has also provided policy support to several environmental nonprofits, including Michigan Environmental Council, Clean Water Action, and now Flow. He's authored many books on the Great Lakes and water protection, and he serves as an adjunct instructor in environmental policy at Western Michigan and Michigan State University. We are so grateful to have Dave as our teacher here at Flow for nearly 5 years, providing us critical historic insights to navigate today's complex landscape for securing environmental justice and stewardship of our Great Lakes. And Sally Cole-Misch is an environmental writer, author, and friend of Flow. Throughout her career, including her writing and consulting business at the International Joint Commission, and most recently in her award-winning novel, The Best Part of Us, Sally has communicated about our essential connections with nature and especially the Great Lakes, and how we can restore and protect our water, land, and air. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dave and Sally. Enjoy tonight's conversation.
Thanks so much, Liz. First, congratulations to you, Dave, for writing another clear, concise, and compelling book about the Great Lakes. I know you first published Great Lakes for Sale in 2008. How long have you been thinking about doing this update, and what prompted you to publish it now?
I've been wanting to do an update almost since the day that the first edition was published, but it became critical really this year because of a drought out west and the renewed speculation about the Great Lakes as a solution to the water shortages out there. And there's just been so much publicity about that and renewed concern in our region about the possibility of the Great Lakes being diverted.
So this amazing book outlines essentially a two-pronged threat to the lakes that you outline in terms of the potential or the realized diversions, and also commercialization or privatization fueled by the bottled water industry, and ironically, the water crises in Flint and now Benton Harbor. You also provide a call to action with recommendations for our region to what we must do now to ensure that we protect the Great Lakes and our waters. So we have a lot to talk about, and I'll begin with a few questions to get us started, followed by readings and book giveaways and 2 additional segments dedicated to you, the audience, being able to submit your questions and comments. And you can do that at any time using the Zoom Q&A feature. But let's start with just a few questions here, Dave, and talk about diversions. And when the idea that Great Lakes water could be diverted to Western agriculture regions in the early 1800s, the region's governors and premiers created the Great Lakes Charter in 1985, which you give a great history on, as well as the Great Lake Compact in 2005. But you also suggest that it's time for our governors and premiers to revisit the compact and strengthen its protections. Why is that?
Well, there's 2 reasons why I think the compact needs to be revisited. One is that it's proven to be a little difficult to keep to its original intent as far as the Great Lakes states themselves. Wisconsin has authorized 4 new or increased diversions since the compact was ratified. That's more diversions, newer increased diversions than the previous century. So there's obviously something that needs to be fixed there, which the Great Lakes states are actually going to be taking advantage of the compact to divert water. The other, I think, in some ways, a more immediate threat is commercialization of water. And the compact has actually legitimized the commercialization of water by leaving an exception for water as a product to be taken out of our region and sold. So those are 2 separate threats. In some ways, the compact, 2008 compact, has shut the door for now on long-range diversions through pipelines or canals, but it's left open the door to commercialization.
So when you talk about commercialization, one of the key things you provide a clear argument about is that the bottled water industry was intimately involved when the compact was created in order to make sure that they protected their product and to create this sense of water as a commodity. Mm-hmm. So can you give us some outline? We have a few minutes here of how does the industry endanger the rights of the Great Lakes water, before and now and into the future?
Yeah, the danger and commercialization of Great Lakes water is couple-fold. One is that if you allow trade in water, you in essence allow pricing to be controlled by private parties, and that can lead to exorbitant charges for water for customers and consumers. The other real concern is access. Think of the Postal Service in the United States. It's mandated to provide service to all citizens. Private firms like UPS or FedEx only take those addresses where they can make money. Similarly with water, if you allow private ownership of water systems and sale of water, the profit motive will not allow access to all customers. Those businesses will concentrate on delivering water to where they can make the most profit. So that's a concern. And, in the end, the final analysis, water is a human right, and we cannot allow it to be marketed or merchandised as a product.
That's one of the interesting things here that you write about the Flint water crisis and now in Benton Harbor and how it's actually hurt the cause of water as a public right. I can understand that certainly they are concerned about drinking their water from the tap. How do you feel that we can change that perception as far as the difference between tap water and bottled water?
Well, the first thing we need to do is invest as a society in our public water infrastructure. The disasters in Flint and Benton Harbor are an example of where we've allowed our infrastructure to deteriorate. We've not spent the money we need as a public on protecting those pipes and delivery systems. The other way we need to, I think, deal with the crisis of confidence in public water is by having public officials deal more directly and honestly with the public. We've had, in both situations, public officials basically trying to minimize the risk and not communicate the health risks so that people can make informed choices. That's the kind of approach that will undermine public confidence.
Okay. And when you see the bottled water industry now in the Great Lakes and particularly in Michigan, do you see a real threat there of making this into even more of a commodity than they are already seeing it as?
I do see that threat, and it actually is coming from several angles. There's now trading in water futures on the Chicago Mercantile. See water treated as a commodity like oil or wheat. Putting a price on something as sacred and as important to us as water is dangerous in a number of ways. Imagine, one estimate of the worth of the human body in terms of the elements in our body is that we're worth about $600. But does anybody think that the value of a human being can be translated into dollars and cents like that? No, and the same is true for water. And I think that the way of the future is to try to resist that tendency.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I know Flo has worked on a lot, and you have as well, is the idea of groundwater. And particularly for the bottled water industry, they've taken the water out from springs in Michigan in particular. So is there a way that if the governors and premiers are going after the compact and trying to strengthen it, as you're suggesting, could you see groundwater being added as a provision in that compact?
I think groundwater needs to be considered as part of the hydrologic whole. I love groundwater. It's very important to me because it's in Michigan, 45% of the population depends on groundwater for drinking water. And you cannot protect the surface water of the Great Lakes without protecting the groundwater that feeds it. About somewhere between 20 and 40% of the volume of the Great Lakes begins as water underground that flows into our rivers and streams.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that much. Wow, that's very cool. Okay, so one of the amazing things is that this book is already available as an audiobook, and we'd like to now hear a passage from Dave's book. Joining us is Norm Wheeler. Norm is the natural choice for this role because he is the voice of the new audiobook version for Great Lakes for Sale. Norm taught science and English at the Leelanau School in Glen Arbor for 33 years. He also plays trumpet and flugelhorn in several bands and performs spoken word poetry and stories.
Hello. Hi, it's Norm. I hope you can hear me. Thanks for the opportunity. From the introduction. In the summer of 2021, as a continuing historic drought starved the American West of water, an old fear surfaced anew in the Great Lakes region. Will Great Lakes water be oasis for drought-stricken America? Asked one headline. Great Lakes diversions could be more numerous, declared another. In August 2021, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation declared the first water shortage ever at Lake Mead in the lower Colorado River Basin, triggering mandatory cuts in water allotments for some basin states. Meanwhile, Great Lakes water levels had approached all-time highs in 2019 and 2020. University of Chicago law professor Todd Henderson authored an opinion column in the Chicago Tribune suggesting the Great Lakes states sell what he called the unneeded water. Vast swaths of California, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico are also experiencing major droughts. Moving water from Lake Michigan to farmers and communities in these places would make everyone better off, Henderson wrote. Given the need for water in the West, the Lake Michigan states alone could reap $244 billion by selling the extra water, he estimated. Out west, some were eyeing the Great Lakes. In May 2021, a resident of the Woodland Hills neighborhood of Los Angeles wrote the LA Times to urge the president Joe Biden's infrastructure plan include water pipelines from the Great Lakes to California. We cannot depend on the good fortune of nature, he wrote. In June 2021, commentator Bill Colley of KLIX Radio, the Fox News affiliate in Twin Falls, Idaho, took up the cause. Under the headline, "Idaho drought could be solved by borrowing the Great Lakes," he boasted that the growing political strength of the West in Washington, D.C. could make Great Lakes water transfers happen. Popular will is the key, Colley said. Millions of thirsty Western voters will have a lot of pull on policy. As the region grows, so does its power in the United States House of Representatives. By its design, the Senate is already favorable to Western concerns. Lake Michigan may be coming to Idaho. Such talk vastly oversimplified the challenges of sending Great Lakes water 2,000 miles westward. Engineering an uphill diversion would be extravagantly expensive, and the Great Lakes states had spent over a quarter century trying to build a defense against this very type of proposal. The issue was more than a matter of public policy, statute, or money. Yes, transferring water. I'm sorry, I lost my place. 2,000 miles westward. And the 8 Great Lakes states were already doing to water what they hoped the West would never be allowed to do. I'll be back.
Thank you, Norm. We look forward to hearing you read another passage in just a few minutes. Before we go back to questions, and we already have several questions from attendees, so thank you very much. We want to give a first book away, and that was based on chosen randomly from your registration number. And the first winner is Katie Switruss of South Lyon. So Dave will sign a book to you, and you'll be getting that in the mail soon. So while you're doing that, Dave, I want to ask the first question, which is from Frederick Rizzo. Sorry if I don't pronounce your names. Frederick Rizzo of Chicago, Illinois, asks, Nestle, what is the status of the situation with them?
Nestle actually sold its Ice Mountain brand, which is the one that's bottled in Michigan, to a company called Blue Triton earlier this year. And the new company, which actually had the permit the state gave Nestle, has let the state know it's going to be increasing the pumping that Nestle was doing, but not as much as Nestle had proposed to do. And it appears the amount of water they want to pump is just enough to keep it below the threshold where there will be a new public comment period. So it's going to move ahead. The increase is going to happen. And the state is still reaping almost nothing from a what is Nestle considers a product that will benefit, or Blue Triton considers a product that will net them hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of profit, and the public will get nothing for it.
Wow, it's amazing. Let's see, Lisa Wyatt of Suttons Bay, Michigan asks, which Michigan and national organizations are leading a thoughtful response to Great Lakes water commercialization?
Well, there are a number of organizations involved. Still, one of the most important is Michigan Citizens for Water Conservation, which the late great Terry Swear was one of the founders of. They're still doing great work and articulating the need for water to remain public. There are groups in Canada that I want to acknowledge, the Council of Canadians and Food and Water Watch, which are binational, that are also involved. There are a number of national organizations, and of course, Flow is leading the charge as well.
Great. Michael Bush of West Branch, Michigan asks, where do private companies actually draw the water? A direct pipe from the land, or from the lake, or inland?
Well, it varies. There are companies that, like Nestle / Blue Triton, that draw their water from springs, because under federal definitions, to market something as spring water, it actually has to come from the ground, where the ground water comes forward. There are bottled water companies, though, that actually take municipal tap water on a large scale and put it into bottles and sell it as something pristine. Those brands would include Dasani and Aquafina. And then there are other companies that bottle small amounts from artesian wells as well.
And that was one of the things why we raised groundwater a while ago, because if groundwater is that much of a water resource and it is connected, one of the interesting things I saw in your book was when you were making that comparison of how outraged we would all be if we saw those pipes directly coming from the lakes instead of the groundwater or springs.
Right. The same amount of water, same volume of water coming out of into a pipe in Lake Michigan, I think would arouse a lot of concern. But when it's in essence hidden at the headwaters of streams, the same volume of water just doesn't make that impression on people. But it may have the same overall impact on the ecosystem. And what we've learned from these spring water withdrawals, and this is what initially motivated Michigan Citizens for Water Conservation, is they can affect the local hydrology of those streams. It can reduce the flow, interfere with fish populations, and have other environmental impacts at the source of the river. It may not be visible to most, but it definitely is visible to those who live in the watershed.
So even though those local communities might be making an economic benefit by having the water companies there, they're also having an economic cost, possibly because of the loss of fisheries.
Yeah, there's an ecological cost for sure in those pumping operations.
Wow. Okay, Ann McPhail of Williamsburg, Michigan asks, can you help us think through the issue of how to protect the Great Lakes while also acknowledging that more places in our country and world will need fresh water resources?
Yeah, that's an issue that I address in the book. I think it's very important. The compact actually has an exception to the ban on diversions for what's called short-term humanitarian emergencies. And that's never been defined. Given that drought and water shortages are already affecting hundreds of millions or billions of people in the world, there may come a time in the not too distant future when there will be a humanitarian crisis where lives will be at stake and perhaps other continents. And if we are going to be good stewards of the water. We cannot be totally shutting the door on sharing the water during short-term periods of excessive or great need. That to me is good stewardship, whereas selling water to people that already have it is not good stewardship. Sharing with people who absolutely need it to survive is good stewardship. And so we need to define those circumstances. The sooner we do that, before the crisis hits, the better we're going to be off. We need to have a full public discussion about what would happen if that crisis arose.
And that's one of the clear things you say in your appendix, which is your call to action, where you really talk about that, of how important it is for the compact and governors and premiers to really define that humanitarian crisis, don't you? Because we do know it's going to happen sooner or later.
Yeah, we don't want the decision to be made under the pressure of an emergency. We want it to be made in a thoughtful way so that the public can participate and help shape that decision.
Mm-hmm. It's just so, there's so many pieces that all fall together here. This is a good question that kind of ties to what we're talking about, of trying to make this all make sense. Leslie Macklin of Leland, Michigan asks, can you please give a quick overview of how all of the states surrounding the Great Lakes work together? How can we support you in encouraging the state of Michigan to continue to do better in partnering with other states to bring scale to Great Lakes efforts?
Good question. First thing that we need to realize is a basic geography lesson, which is that Michigan is the only state that's entirely in the Great Lakes watershed. So other states, the other 7 Great Lakes states, have what I would call divided loyalties. So they have significant areas that are not dependent on the Great Lakes, and significant political constituencies that are not dependent on the Great Lakes. So trying to get all the states to work together sometimes can be difficult because of that. In the case of the compact, the states came together because of this vision of long-range transport of water to the Southwest. There are different opinions among the states as to how Great Lakes water ought to be managed. As I mentioned, Wisconsin has tapped the Great Lakes now for economic development. I would say urban sprawl, which I don't think is an appropriate use of Great Lakes water. What we need to do is, I think, get back to basics, and that is to get the citizens of those states, who I think are better stewards in some cases, maybe most cases, than the politicians, to join forces with citizens in Michigan to develop a Great Lakes protection agenda that takes into account the issues of commercialization and privatization. And that's something that we in Michigan have to be the lead on.
And do you see this, we'll get back to them, just follow-up question here is, do you see that something like the Infrastructure Act could provide the opportunity for citizen groups to really lead the way for our government to start to organize through the infrastructure as far as how they give that funding for different things?
I think there are 2 things to say about the infrastructure. One is that we have to be on guard that the money is not used to stimulate public-private partnerships where there are private owners coming on board with some of these water systems. What we've learned in other communities across the country is when water services are privatized, we inevitably see hikes in prices for water delivery or higher prices for customers. And we see deteriorating maintenance because the profit motive for these privately owned utilities means they'll invest less in maintenance. So we want to make sure that the water infrastructure money that's now coming out across the country is not used to fuel these partnerships. And on the positive side, I think we need to make sure that Michigan and other states include in their infrastructure funding bills that use the federal money stipulations that will only be used for public purposes, and that the public trust is considered in all the operations.
So one of the things Carmelita Nelson of St. Paul, Minnesota notes that in 2021, Minnesota's legislature passed a law prohibiting bulk transport or sale of water more than 50 miles. Is that something that you could see all of the states doing?
Well, Minnesota's situation is a little unique because the area, let me back up a little bit. There was a water train proposal. A company had actually proposed pumping groundwater in an area near the Twin Cities, which is outside the Great Lakes Basin, and then shipping it by rail to unknown destinations, but probably to water-starved states like Colorado. That caused a big uproar in Minnesota. The legislature, as the questioner pointed out, is now legislated against that. The compact, the Great Lakes Compact, currently prohibits shipments by rail of Great Lakes water. So the compact actually closed that loophole. But I think the threat posed by rail transport of water is that it's probably more economically feasible and affordable than some of these schemes to build, pipelines that run 2,000 miles. So need to be on guard for that as a long-run threat to the Great Lakes, but not an immediate threat.
And also probably recognizing what is a short-term threat, humanitarian crisis, and how do you designate when it's not a crisis anymore so that you don't continue to provide water past that crisis.
Right, we need to define those circumstances very, very clearly.
Steve Rudell of Durango, Colorado asks, what is the status of FLOW's Public Water Public Justice Act?
Well, hello, Colorado. Nice to have you on with us tonight. Yeah. Well, FLOW has drafted this Public Water Public Justice Act, which I think is a model statute that Michigan should adopt in other states. It includes provisions that assure that water remains public, and it also would set up a royalty system where companies that get the privilege, not the right, but the privilege to take Michigan water for bottling would pay a royalty that would then go into the fund to assure access to water for all Michigan citizens and would invest further in infrastructure. We've been promoting that bill with constituent groups, having discussions about ways to improve it. And we're hopeful that in the next session of the legislature, which will begin over a year from now in 2023, we can see some action on it.
It's great. It's so interesting, all the possibilities of how this could all come together if citizen groups and governments are all able to work together. And obviously seeing our region as a true Great Lakes region rather than the Rust Belt or the Midwest or whatever. David Swan asks, thanks for updating this really important book, Dave. We appreciate it. What movement is happening with designating our groundwater as the 6th Great Lake?
Well, I have to put a plug in for FLOW's 6th Great Lake Initiative. We put out 2 reports on groundwater. And the reason we call it the 6th Great Lake is not because there's a lake under the ground, but because the amount of water under the Great Lakes, the land of the Great Lakes, is equal to the volume of Lake Huron. So we've got tremendous amounts of water that need to be protected. What we've been trying to do is to get policymakers in Lansing to recognize that groundwater is connected to surface water and therefore needs to be protected as guarded as protectively as our surface water. We've got a number of proposals for our state policy and legislation that unfortunately in the current political climate are not going anywhere, but we're hopeful that they will in future years. And I think the corollary to that is we need public awareness of the importance of groundwater. It's out of sight, therefore out of mind to a lot of people, but our education efforts, I think, will help people visualize groundwater as being in need of protection.
A related question is Tanya Kabala of Whitehall, Michigan asks, what is the status of Ottawa County's groundwater? And do we have other similar areas in the state?
Ottawa County is unique, well, not unique, but it's a dramatic example of how development can stress our water resources. No one would think that Ottawa County, which is right next to Lake Michigan, could have water shortages, but it does. And that's because population growth there has overtaxed the aquifer, and it's now, the pumping is happening at such a rate that it's drying up naturally occurring chlorides, which make the water unappetizing and in some cases unhealthy to drink. So we have the paradox of Lake Michigan right next to a water shortage. And to get control of that, we're going to have more water conservation, better growth planning so that water use does not outstrip the availability of groundwater. And there are other counties in Michigan like that. There's a couple around the Saginaw Bay and a couple others in Southeast Michigan that have similar trends that could have similar problems.
So a question, a really interesting one is Bonnie Dankert asks, could Michigan work toward making the Great Lakes watershed a designated national sanctuary, similar to the vast Monterey Bay National Sanctuary off of California? I realize there are two sanctuaries existing within the Great Lakes. I assume these fall under federal regulations are enforced. Can you comment on any aspects of these issues?
Well, that idea is one that's close to my heart. I've always thought the Great Lakes should be a nationally designated resource. That idea was discussed back in about 15 years ago when the Healing Our Waters Coalition formed. There was some thought to a national designation of the Great Lakes. I would like to see that, but we have not yet found a legislator to introduce that legislation. But it's a good idea.
Mm-hmm. And how do we, Lynn Fraze or Fraze asks, how do we ensure that the voices of Native Americans are at the table in all of these discussions? Can you give some history of treaties regarding water?
Well, we have a number of treaties with Indigenous peoples that in which they reserve the rights to use of water and access to water. And that's played out very well in the Nestle/Blue Triton controversy, where the tribes have exercised their rights and intervened legally in efforts to control and limit what Nestle is doing. What I'd like to see really is that these sovereign nations, the tribes and First Nations on the Canadian side, have equal footing with the United States and Canadian governments in decision-making about the Great Lakes. That has not been true in the past, but I think it should be in the future. And similarly, the Canadian government ought to have more of a formal say in decisions made by Great Lakes states on this side of the border.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because when you look at the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which is between the United States and Canada, and Dave and I both worked on through the International Joint Commission, you can see how it's coming up on its 50th anniversary and it's time for possible renewal or adjustment. And it ties in perfectly to John Jackson of Ontario. Hi, John. Asks, Dave, do you think there's a role for the IJC in addressing the water issues you raise in this book? If so, how are they doing it and how could they improve?
John, there's definitely a role for the IJC, both within its existing mandate and I think within a mandate that should be expanded. The Commission has done a pretty good job in the past of analyzing water trends and coming up with suggestions on how to protect the waters of the Great Lakes. And I should also add that Jim Olson from Flow and Maud Barlow was with the Council of Canadians. They made a presentation to the IJC in which they recommended that the public trust doctrine be a sort of a backup for existing legal authorities, and the Commission ultimately endorsed that. But I think in the long run, this may sound like pie in the sky, but I do think we need to revisit the Boundary Waters Treaty and have more of a role for the IJC in passing on major water withdrawals and diversions.
And do you see that as a way that possibly Indigenous nations and First Nations and tribes could be incorporated into that treaty at that time?
I think the treaty and the agreement, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, should provide equal footing and decision-making roles for Indigenous peoples, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And Ray Hall asks, how do you see the Justice 40 play in water for Indigenous people? And would you consider a presentation to the United Nations Environment Program?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd love to.
Great. I'm going to switch here and ask one first question before we go back to Norm for a reading. We have a few other questions, but I want to ask this question to try and get people thinking they may have questions, because a large part of your book at the end talks about the public trust doctrine, which you just brought up. And you really emphasize that that's a way that we could be moving forward to reflect that all of our policies and mandates really reflect that clean, safe, and affordable water is and should be a human right. So can you just define for us before we go back to Norm as far as what is the public trust doctrine?
Yeah, at the risk of offending lawyers who are better experts at the public trust doctrine, I think it's fair to say it's essentially an ancient doctrine of common law that says water cannot be privatized or privately owned, that it belongs to the people as a whole, and that government has a responsibility to act as a trustee on behalf of the public to protect it. And that private uses of common water can only be authorized if they don't impair the public uses. So that doctrine, I think, is great wisdom. It goes back 1,500 years, and it provides a sort of a philosophical and, I think in some cases, legal footing for protecting water from privatization.
Okay. We'll come back to another segment of everyone's questions and comments, but we want to go back to Norm right now for a second reading.
Okay, chapter 10. In the Great Lakes region, large-scale pumping, packaging, and sale of water was not an issue until the dawn of the 21st century. But small-scale bottling operations in the Great Lakes states are old, dating back to the late 1800s. Artesian waters thought to have health-giving properties were commonly sold. The impact of such operations, however, was minuscule, and the idea that it was a threat to a public resource never took hold because most water merchants operated in local markets. If the assertion of private ownership of water is not new to the Great Lakes, the exploitation of the asserted right for major corporate financial gain is. A Michigan Department of Environmental Quality list of the state's water packagers showed in 2004 that none, other than the Nestle operation, drew substantial amounts of water from the ground for sale to markets outside the Great Lakes watershed. According to Nestle itself, about 30% of the water withdrawn at its dead stream pumps in Mecosta County was being sold outside the Great Lakes watershed in 2005. Nestle's groundwater withdrawals, bottling facilities, and monumental profits would not have existed without savvy marketing, an unrelenting attack by neoconservatives on public goods, and high-profile contamination episodes involving municipal water supplies. Commenting on observations made during a trip to the U.S. in the summer of 2006, Stephen Hesse wrote for the Japan Times that he was used to seeing Americans walking around in public toting cell phones and beverages. But what caught my eye this time was the bottled water craze. For years, people have been drinking spring water, mineral water, and sparkling water, but what used to be a modest health trend has mutated into a worrisome marketing scam. Hesse observed that the price markup for the convenience, anywhere from 240 to 10,000 times, was remarkable. But after interviewing Tony Clark of the Canadian Polaris Institute, Hesse also expressed concern about the implications of treating water as a commercial product privately owned. Selling water, it seems, is not about marketing a value-added product. It is about selling an image, much like a real estate agent peddling a mirage, Hesse said. With so many consumers seduced by the mirage, he added, the switch is setting the stage for corporations to profit from taking over control of public water supplies. In 2018, bottled water was the leading marketed beverage in the U.S. The average consumer drank 42 gallons per year of it, up from 10.5 gallons in 2002. And the industry made $31 billion in profit.
Norm, I'm sure from listening to you, there's a lot of folks that are going to want to be purchasing the audiobook. And I know that that's going to be listed on the chat in the Zooms, and it will also be listed at the end of this program as to where you can purchase the book in all formats. And we want to give the second book away, second book giveaway this time. And this is going to Suzanne Greenlee of Royal Oak. So Dave, you can sign that one.
Thank you.
While I'm asking congratulations to Suzanne. What Norm actually talked about or read from your book is perfect for Michael Bush's question. And he asks, are the companies that want to sell Michigan water active in lobbying the state legislature?
No surprise, they are definitely active. They have the ear of decision makers in the Capitol and sometimes in our agencies. And there's only one counter to that, and that is for citizens to become more active in offsetting that voice.
And oh my goodness, we have a really long one here. Hang on. Okay. Frank Rizzo asked the follow-up question first. Nestle or the successor company Trion, what can we do about what they're doing in Michigan?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is to become active in corresponding with our environmental agencies. The issue I mentioned before is that Blue Triton has come in and tried to evade by controlling the amount of water it's going to withdraw public scrutiny. And we need for citizens to communicate with our state environmental agency about that. We could provide some information specifics on that as a follow-up to this show. But I think the main thing that people need to do is to begin educating others about the threat of bottled water and how it's not just a local threat to the specific streams and springs where the water is taken, but it's a long-range commercial threat to public ownership. And so education and activism are the two prongs of that approach.
Terry Miller asks, hi Dave,
Hi, Terry.
could you provide context on the current legal situation regarding Line 5 pipeline under the Straits of Mackinac?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, Terry. The public trust doctrine comes into play with respect to the Line 5 pipelines. It's a very complicated legal situation right now, but to boil it down, the state of Michigan is in court suing Enbridge, the energy company that operates Line 5, in essence to nullify the easement that the company got back in 1953 to use the bottomlands of the Great Lakes as a highway for their oil. The public trust doctrine gives the state the power and the responsibility really to protect those bottomlands and those waters from being degraded. So if there was a spill in the Straits of Mackinac and Enbridge is a lousy safety record, it could cause $6 billion of economic harm to our state. So the Attorney General Nestle is trying to pursue shutdown of that line and termination of the easement. And we'll see how that goes.
One of the things that struck me was in reading your book was about Michigan Governor Whitmer using the public trust doctrine as an argument to shut down Line 5. Does this suggest the power that it wields for protecting the lakes, for using the water as a commodity?
Definitely. I don't want to do an advertisement for Flow, but I think that Governor Whitmer's action would not have taken place without Flow, and specifically without Jim Olson, who's been a champion of the public trust doctrine for a long time, and Liz Kirkwood, our director, bringing that doctrine to the governor and to the attorney general and getting them to see its potential value in protecting the Straits of Mackinac and the Great Lakes from an oil spill.
So Tom Henry asks from Toledo.
Hi, Tom.
Yeah, we know Tom Henry. He's been a lifelong Great Lakes reporter. As global water shortages become more acute this century, how much more will water quality itself come into play in terms of protecting Great Lakes water volume? What we're talking about is potable or potentially potable, i.e. able to be treated water for human subsistence. Could this give rise to the global rights of nature movement, including the Lake Erie Bill of Rights that a federal judge ruled unconstitutional? How will shortages of potable water, not just total water you can look at, play into Western Lake Erie algae runoff land issues and the Line 5 pipeline controversy?
There's a lot to unpack there. Tom's a good journalist, I'll say that. Well, I think it obviously will play into that issue. I'm trying to break that question down into several parts. I think the one I want to tackle is the rights of nature idea. This is in this case was a ballot proposal that the citizens of Toledo approved a couple of years ago, which was a Lake Erie Bill of Rights, which essentially gave Lake Erie legal status to be protected by citizens from their governments in some cases. Again, not being a lawyer, I don't want to assert things that I can't back up, but essentially the rights of nature movement, I think, is very comparable in its impact to the public trust doctrine. So either one could be a useful tool. As far as the issue of potable water, we may remember back in 2014, algae blooms on Western Lake Erie forced a temporary shutdown of the Toledo water supply, and 400,000 people were unable to use their public water supply for a couple of days because of the toxic algae. And unless we get a handle on the sources of that pollution, we're going to see the Great Lakes be degraded as a drinking water source. So in the case of Western Lake Erie, I think it's pretty much a consensus now that we need to do a much better job of controlling agricultural runoff, which comes from animal waste, fertilizers, and so forth.
I was struck by something that you have in the beginning and end of your book that's really a constant message, is about getting our governments to do their jobs when it comes to protecting our waters. What do you feel is a key way that citizens can help to make this happen?
One key way is something that just occurred the other night in Traverse City at the behest of Liz Kirkwood, our director. The City Commission of Traverse City approved a resolution that affirms that water is a human right, not just a product or some option, but a human right that all people should have access to, and that it should be protected as a public trust resource. So I think one thing people can do is to take that kind of resolution and get it adopted by their communities across the Great Lakes Basin. And I should say that that resolution originally sprang from a Chicago water board where Cam Davis, who's been a longtime Great Lakes advocate and leader, got the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District down there to affirm water as a human right. And then his concern, Cam's concern specifically, arose out of the talk about water becoming a commodity. So we need our citizens and our public local governments to stand up for water as a public and not a private resource.
Okay, and that resolution will be on the Flow website so that citizens who want to take that to their own local communities can find it there. Okay, great. One thing that wonderful Jim Olson would like to say, that in Dave Dempsey's usual understated style that readers can understand, often with a soundless wallop, so be careful not to miss the following quote. Somehow, in all the talk about building walls around the Great Lakes to protect them from raids by the Sunbelt, the issue of ownership and sale of Great Lakes water had gotten lost, not because of public indifference, but because of myopia in the circles that determine policy choices in state capitals and the US Capitol. And that really gets to the heart of it, isn't it? Is one of the quote that really struck home for me was the very first one you have on the first page, about that water is our one sacred right.
Right. It's a quote I really am fond of, which is why I put it at the head of the book. And it's from Brian Fagan in a book called Elixir, A History of Water. And he says, history teaches us that the societies that last longest are those that treat water with respect, as an elixir of life and a gift from the gods. We seem to have forgotten this compelling lesson. Mm-hmm. But I think the public will not forget that. I think that it's the policymakers that forget that. Yes,
and it pulls perfectly together with what Jim is asking for the quote. Wow, we have a lot of questions here, so we'll try and throw in. I have to ask two real quickly that have been here for a while. Is Ann Rogers is asking, when is your book signing?
We don't have any scheduled right now, but you can just, Ann, you can just call me up and I'll get you a book. But we're going to be scheduling some. Obviously, it's a little difficult with the pandemic, but right. We're doing some more virtual events soon. And
where you can download the audiobook?
It's not available yet. It's in final engineering with my trusty audio expert in Wisconsin, but we should have it available in the next couple of weeks. So we'll have that information on the Flow website at the time that it becomes available.
Okay, wanted to get those in because they've been here for a while. Dan Robinson, hi Dan, asks us, in your book, Lake Nation, you explore the question of what makes people move from loving the lakes to doing something to protect them. Any further thoughts on that in regards to this issue of the water in the basin possibly being for sale?
Well, it's an interesting issue that I've wrestled with throughout most of my career. There's no shortage of caring about the Great Lakes. People are attracted to them and they're very loyal to them. but how do you make that leap from concern to action? Especially in a time when people are very cynical about government. But there's really no choice but for us to use the institutions that are available to us to recognize that the power rests in us to control government, not the reverse. And throughout my career, I've seen relatively small numbers of people in the public have enormous impact on public policy. Our elected officials in many cases are not used to hearing from people. So if we just speak up, we can make a huge impact. I'm hoping that my book will spur more action just by making people conscious of the threat of commercialization in particular. So I'm hoping in a small way the book can contribute to that move toward more action.
Absolutely. Okay, so one question off of what you're saying here, I'm kind of jumping around to try and get them in all before we're done. Lisa Wyatt asks, are there other countries or US states which can help to inform us about water protection?
When it comes to water quality, I think there are US states that can do that. I should say one state that is actually, I think the only state that has affirmed water as a human right so far is California, which of course is a state that faces many water shortages, but they've at least acknowledged that water is a human right, which no other state has done. As far as managing water conserving water, there are a number of states that are ahead of Michigan in terms of conservation requirements, and that's a list that includes some of our eastern states, and they're scattered around the country, so we can learn from all of those.
Okay. Let's see. Akita Mandalia asks, is it possible that eventually there might be some shame attached to drinking water from disposable bottles? Could the market implode and maybe just fizzle out? That's a nice idea.
Well, I think if we made more health information available about bottled water, we would see a turn against it. The industry sells bottled water as a healthful alternative to other drinks, but tests show that the volume of microplastics in bottled water is much higher than in tap water, which makes sense because those are plastic bottles. There's also been cases as recently as last spring where there was a serious illness and one death was caused by a bottled water company in Nevada. So there's no guarantee that bottled water is a healthful drink. And I think that's one step. And I think the other step is to link bottled water with this concern about losing public control and access to water. People look at a bottle of water instead of as some convenience on a shelf and look at that bottle and say that's actually sacred water that is being turned into a private product. I think the reaction would be much different.
Okay, so we're running out of time. It's almost 7 o'clock, but I want to throw in this last question because I think it's important because you talk about climate change in your book quite a bit. Terry Miller asked, Dave, could you comment on the impact of climate change on Great Lakes water since we've recently seen algae blooms in Lake Superior?
Right, there's actually been two impacts of climate change on Great Lakes water. We have now sort of more of a whipsawing effect where our water levels go up and down much faster and higher and lower than they did previously. And that's believed to be because of the change in weather patterns where we have periods of dry weather followed by major storms. We saw huge storms in southeast Michigan this summer. So there's that impact. The other impact is that with warming waters, there are opportunities, as Terry mentioned, for algae to occur in areas where we've never seen it before, such as Lake Superior. And with the warming of the waters, we're also seeing changes in the aquatic life in the Great Lakes. Different fish are surviving farther north, and some of our native species are moving northward in the system. So we're going to be seeing a number of those kinds of changes. A lot of people talk about the Great Lakes as being a climate refuge where people will come from other parts of the country as well. We have to prepare for that. What if in 50 years there are 20 million Michiganders instead of 10 million? How are we going to handle that kind of growth? So that's a major challenge for the next couple of generations.
So many areas for our states and provinces to really get their act together and work together to have citizens leading the way.
And looking forward, we can't just focus on today, but also on these long-term threats.
So it's almost 7 o'clock. Dave, thank you so much for your
Thank
time,
you, Sally.
for your wonderful writing. You have about a half dozen questions here, which I'm guessing we will definitely pass on to Dave, and I'm guessing you'll be happy to answer these in emails or on the Flow website or a different.
Yes, we'll
Different way?
follow.
Okay, and there is one, let's see, Michael Bush had asked quite a long time ago, will this talk be available for later viewing? And absolutely, and I'll turn it over to Liz to do those final comments.
Well, what an amazing conversation. Dave, just congratulations on a really extraordinary book. So timely, so incredibly important. Thank you. And thank you, Sally, for just a terrific conversation. We want to thank you all for attending this evening, engaging. The number of questions and the kind of depth you all go to is what makes this work so meaningful. And you know, as Dave has alluded to, it really is up to the people of the Great Lakes region to define the future, and identifying and protecting water as a human right is fundamental to that process. We'll be following up with you with a recording with links to where you can purchase Dave's book, Great Lakes for Sale, for yourself or for gift for others. And we hope that we'll continue to connect with you on more webinars through our bi-monthly newsletter. And please stay in touch. Thank you and have a wonderful night.